Hey guys, today's story begins with something almost too ordinary to notice: clothing. But for much of history, the cloth closest to the body was not just warmth, modesty, or identity. It could also be a small moving world of hunger, irritation, shame, and survival. Before we settle in, tell me where you're watching from and what quiet corner of history you'd like to hear next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, leaving a like is a simple way to support it. And if you'd like more calm, intelligent history videos for late evenings, you're warmly invited to subscribe. Now, let's step into a world where one of the most intimate struggles of daily life was not fought on battlefields or in royal courts, but in the seams of a shirt. To understand what it was like to live with lice in your clothes, we have to begin with a small correction. Modern viewers often imagine lice as a problem of dirt, carelessness, or personal failure. But in many earlier societies, body lice were not mainly a sign that someone was uniquely unclean. They were a sign that people lived in crowded rooms, wore garments for long stretches, slept close together, lacked regular access to hot water, and owned far fewer changes of clothing than we do today. That distinction matters because it changes the story from one of disgust into one of conditions. Lice were not simply a nuisance crawling through the margins of history. They were part of the material world people had to manage, endure, hide, and sometimes accept as nearly unavoidable. The creature itself was small enough to vanish into habit. Body lice did not live chiefly in the hair, as head lice do. They lived in clothing, especially in the folds, seams, collars, waistbands, and places where fabric held warmth close to the skin. They moved onto the body to feed, then returned to the cloth. In that simple rhythm was the source of so much misery. A shirt, a tunic, a shift, a soldier's undershirt, a laborer's woolen garment, or a poor traveler's coat could become both protection and prison. Imagine, for a moment, a linen undergarment worn beneath heavier wool. It is not washed every day. It may not be washed every week. It absorbs sweat, skin oils, dust, smoke, and the closeness of sleep. At first there is only itching. Then the itching becomes familiar. A person scratches without thinking. At the neck, along the ribs, beneath the arms, around the waist where cloth presses tight. Tiny bites become red marks. Red marks become scabs. Scabs reopen under fingernails. And because this was ordinary, people learned to live around it. They picked through clothing by daylight. They turned garments inside out and inspected seams. They crushed lice between fingernails. They shook blankets. They held clothing near heat when fuel was available. They changed linen when they could. In wealthier homes, laundry was not a small domestic chore but a major system of labor, water, soap, boiling, drying, and storage. Among poorer households, every one of those steps could be difficult. The hidden irony is that clothing itself, one of humanity's great protections, helped create the perfect habitat. The better a garment trapped warmth, the more inviting it could be. The more layers a person wore, the more places there were for insects to hide. In cold climates, in winter quarters, in military camps, in prisons, aboard ships, and in crowded lodging houses, removing clothing long enough to clean it could be uncomfortable or even dangerous. So lice were not merely a private irritation. They were a quiet measure of pressure. Poverty, war, migration, weather, labor, and the limits of sanitation before modern plumbing. In medieval and early modern Europe, for example, most people did not own wardrobes in the modern sense. A person might have outer garments meant to last, and linen worn next to the skin when affordable. Linen was valued partly because it could be washed more readily than wool. But even that depended on resources. Washing required water carried by hand, fuel to heat it, space to dry cloth, and time taken from other work. In damp weather, drying could be slow. In cramped homes, damp laundry could be another burden. This is one reason the history of lice is also a history of laundry. Cleanliness was not just an idea. It was infrastructure. It was access. For the well-to-do, the white linen visible at cuffs and collars became more than fashion. It signaled that someone had enough underclothing to change it, enough servants or hired washers to clean it, and enough money to maintain a clean appearance. The whiteness of linen could be a social announcement. It suggested order, refinement, and distance from bodily unpleasantness. But beneath that signal was a practical battle against sweat, smell, and parasites. For the poor, the same battle was fought with fewer weapons. A laborer might come home after work with clothing damp from weather or sweat. A servant might sleep in a crowded attic. A child might share bedding with siblings. A traveler might spend nights in inns where mattresses and blankets had already held many bodies. In these places, lice could pass easily from garment to garment, blanket to coat, coat to shirt, shirt to skin. And once they were established, they were persistent. The most unsettling part was not always the bite itself. It was the feeling of invasion. A person could never be entirely still. Even at night, when the body most needed rest, there might be a crawling sensation under the cloth. Sleep could become shallow. Scratching could become automatic. The skin might thicken and darken from repeated irritation. In severe cases, the body carried the marks of long infestation almost like a map. Yet people were not helpless. They had knowledge, habits, and remedies, though not always reliable ones. They knew that changing and washing clothing helped. They knew that heat could kill. They knew that certain powders, herbs, oils, or fumes might discourage insects, even if results varied. They knew that seams mattered. Many people were more observant than modern stereotypes allow. They lived close to cloth, skin, fire, water, and insects. Their knowledge was practical because it had to be, but what they often lacked was consistency. One clean shirt did not solve a crowded bed. One washing did not solve a military barracks. One careful person could still be reinfested by a household, a ship, a prison, or a camp. This is where the subject becomes larger than discomfort. Body lice were not only irritating, they could also carry disease. In later centuries, especially in war, famine, and mass displacement, lice became associated with epidemic typhus, trench fever, and relapsing fever. People did not always understand the exact mechanism, but they understood that crowded, lousy conditions and sickness often traveled together. The insect was small, but the consequences could be enormous. In ordinary life, however, most encounters with lice were less dramatic and more wearing. They were part of the background noise of hardship. They made sleep worse. They made work more uncomfortable. They carried embarrassment. They could mark a person socially even when the real cause was poverty or circumstance. They reminded people that the body was never separate from the world around it. And that may be the hardest thing for a modern listener to fully imagine. Today, clothing feels personal. We choose it, wash it, fold it, replace it. We expect it to be clean by default. In the past, clothing was often expensive, labor-intensive, and deeply reused. A garment might be patched, handed down, pawned, inherited, or remade. Cloth had value. Throwing it away because it had become infested was not always possible. So people negotiated with discomfort. They scratched in private. They inspected seams. They endured. They blamed themselves sometimes and blamed others often. They associated lice with poverty, soldiers, sailors, prisoners, beggars, refugees, and the socially vulnerable. But the boundary was never perfect. In moments of war or crisis, lice crossed class lines with ease. A nobleman in a campaign tent could become lousy. A soldier in fine uniform could be tormented beneath it. A ship's officer could share the same crawling misery as the men below deck. War made everything worse. Armies gathered thousands of bodies in close quarters. Men marched in the same clothes, slept in rough shelters, and had limited chance to wash. Uniforms became heavy with sweat, mud, and infestation. Blankets were shared or reused. Camps attracted filth not because soldiers were uniquely careless, but because armies produced logistical problems on a vast scale. Food, water, waste, shelter, clothing, wounds, and weather all had to be managed. Often they were managed badly. For a soldier, lice could become a constant companion. Not an event, not a single unpleasant episode, but a condition of service. Letters, diaries, and memoirs from different wars often mention lice with a blunt familiarity. Men searched for them during pauses, joked bitterly about them, burned or boiled garments when they could, and sometimes accepted that the relief would not last. There is a strange intimacy in this. The grand narratives of war speak of commanders, strategy, flags, and nations. But the soldier's day might be governed by his feet, his stomach, and the insects in his shirt. And in that small reality, history becomes more honest. Because lice remind us that people in the past lived through their bodies. They did not experience history as dates on a page. They experienced it as cold wool, damp straw, smoke in the room, a collar rubbing the neck, a bite under the waistband, a night of broken sleep, and the dread of discovering that the garment they had to wear tomorrow was alive with the same problem as yesterday. Even in peaceful towns, clothing lice could shape behavior in subtle ways. People avoided close contact with those believed to be infested. Hosts worried about bedding. Travelers carried risk from place to place. Servants could be blamed for household infestations. The poor could be stigmatized for conditions they had little power to change. Clean linen became moralized, as if bodily management were simply a matter of character rather than resources. This is one of the recurring patterns in social history. Practical disadvantages become moral judgments. A person without enough clean clothing is called dirty. A family without space is called disorderly. A worker without time is called careless. But the insect did not care about morality. Cared about warmth, fabric, and access to blood. That simple fact quietly undermines many assumptions. To live with lice in your clothes was to live with a problem that was physical, social, and emotional all at once. Could make the body feel unreliable. Could make rest uncertain. It could make a person ashamed of being touched, seen, or suspected. It could turn a seam into a hiding place and a bed into a risk. And yet, for countless people, it was not the central drama of life. That is important too. They still worked, married, prayed, traded, cooked, raised children, told stories, and found moments of comfort. Lice were woven into the hardships of ordinary existence, not always because people ignored them, but because life demanded attention to many troubles at once. A mother washing linen might be fighting lice, smell, illness, reputation, and domestic order in the same task. A soldier picking insects from his shirt might be managing both irritation and morale. A servant trying to keep clean might be protecting not only comfort but employment. A prisoner covered in bites might be experiencing neglect made visible on the skin. The more closely we look, the less this story is about insects alone. It is about the distance between modern expectations and historical reality. It is about what cleanliness costs when water is carried, fuel is precious, clothing is limited, rooms are crowded, and the body is constantly exposed to the conditions around it. It is about how quickly comfort disappears when ordinary systems fail. And perhaps most of all, it is about how people made life bearable in circumstances that were never meant to be comfortable. By the time we reach the great armies and crowded cities of the 18th and 19th centuries, the problem does not vanish. In some ways, it becomes more visible. Expanding populations, urban poverty, industrial labor, barracks, workhouses, ships, and prisons all created environments where bodies and clothing came into repeated contact under strain. Reformers began to describe filth and infestation not only as private failings but as public problems. Slowly, unevenly, the fight against lice became tied to larger questions of housing, sanitation, military discipline, public health, and the dignity of the poor. But before those reforms could matter, someone still had to face the immediate reality. A garment turned inside out, a seam held close to the light, and the small, patient enemy waiting in the folds. And for many people, that inspection happened so often that it became almost ritualistic. A pause beside a fire, fingers running slowly along a seam, a shirt stretched toward the light, a thumb pressing against fabric with practiced suspicion. The movements were repetitive, quiet, and deeply human. Entire generations learned them without ever imagining a world in which such habits might disappear. In poorer districts of growing European cities, especially by the 18th century, the struggle became entangled with urban life itself. Cities promised work, trade, and opportunity, but they also compressed bodies together in ways earlier rural communities often had not. A single room might hold a whole family, or several unrelated laborers sleeping in shifts. Air circulated badly. Moisture lingered. Bedding was reused continuously. Clothing dried slowly in cramped interiors darkened by soot and smoke. And beneath all of this sat an uncomfortable truth that reformers would gradually discover. Cleanliness is easier to praise than to provide. It was possible for wealthier observers to look at the crowded poor and see moral weakness. Pamphlets, sermons, and social commentary often framed filth as evidence of laziness or vice. But when investigators actually entered tenements, workhouses, and lodging houses, they encountered something more complicated. They found people trying to remain respectable under relentless physical pressure. Women boiling laundry late into the evening. Children sleeping 2 or 3 to a bed. Workers returning from factories too exhausted to scrub garments by hand after 14-hour days. This distinction mattered enormously because body lice flourished not merely where people lacked standards, but where people lacked control over conditions. A laborer might own only one serviceable shirt. Washing it thoroughly meant temporarily losing it. In winter, drying it fully before morning could be impossible. Damp fabric against the skin could bring illness of another kind. So compromises accumulated. Clothes were aired instead of washed. Linen was spot cleaned. Outer garments were brushed. Blankets were shaken. Small victories replaced permanent solutions. And sometimes those small victories mattered emotionally as much as physically. A clean collar, even temporarily clean, could preserve dignity. Fresh linen on a Sunday could separate sacred time from working time. The smell of soap could signal care, order, and self-respect in a world where comfort was fragile. Historians sometimes focus on sanitation as a technical development, but for ordinary people, cleanliness was also psychological. It offered moments of relief from the constant closeness of the body and its irritations. Yet the body always returned. One of the stranger realities of historical clothing is how rarely garments were fully separated from human presence. Modern closets isolate clothing when not in use. Earlier clothing often remained near heat, bedding, kitchens, workshops, or shared sleeping spaces. Cloth absorbed not only sweat, but smoke, grease, dust, and the lingering life of crowded interiors. Lice thrived in that continuity. Travelers noticed this immediately when moving between environments. Diaries from inns and roadside lodging houses often describe beds with a mixture of exhaustion and suspicion. A traveler arriving after dark might desperately need sleep, yet hesitate before lying down fully clothed among unfamiliar blankets. Inns varied enormously in quality, but even respectable establishments struggled against infestation. Mattresses were difficult to clean deeply. Straw fillings aged. Bedding circulated among strangers. The irony was cruel. Travel already exhausted the body, but the very places designed for rest could produce fresh discomfort. Some travelers developed routines bordering on superstition. They inspected bed frames. They preferred sleeping in cloaks. They kept garments close to fires. They avoided placing clothes directly on bedding. The experienced traveler often sounded less like an adventurer and more like a cautious manager of physical risks. And this caution extended far beyond Europe. Wherever large populations lived in close contact without modern sanitation infrastructure, similar struggles emerged in different forms. Climate changed the details. Materials changed. Garments differed. But the underlying relationship between cloth, crowding, and parasites remained stubbornly familiar. The problem was not confined to one civilization or one century. It followed human density itself. Still, there were differences in how societies interpreted infestation. Some viewed it primarily through medicine. Others moralized it. Some accepted it with weary pragmatism. In many cases, people understood the immediate mechanics long before they understood disease transmission scientifically. They knew proximity mattered. They knew shared bedding mattered. They knew camps, prisons, and ships were dangerous environments. What they lacked was not observation, but often the invisible explanation connecting lice to epidemic disease. That gap became devastating during periods of war. By the time Europe entered the age of enormous standing armies and continental conflict, soldiers were operating within systems almost designed to spread infestation. Uniforms were worn continuously. Men marched in rain, mud, and heat. Laundry opportunities disappeared during campaigns. Supply systems broke down. Barracks concentrated thousands of bodies into enclosed spaces. And unlike the polished military paintings that later generations would admire, real armies smelled intensely of human strain. Wet wool, leather, smoke, unwashed skin, latrines, damp straw, horses, blood, illness. The romantic image of military glory often concealed a world of constant bodily discomfort. Within that world, lice became both ordinary and relentless. Napoleonic soldiers complained about them. Civil War soldiers complained about them. Prisoners complained about them. Sailors complained about them. The language changes across centuries, but the tone remains remarkably consistent. Exhaustion mixed with resignation. There are accounts of men removing shirts during brief pauses in marching, turning them inside out, and running the fabric rapidly through flame to kill insects hiding in the seams. Not enough to burn the garment, just enough heat to force death into the cloth. It was crude, imperfect, and temporary. But temporary relief was often the only realistic goal. That temporary nature is important to understand. Modern solutions tend to aim for elimination. Historical people often aimed simply to reduce suffering enough to continue functioning. And functioning mattered because life rarely paused for discomfort. A woman working as a laundress in the 19th century might spend her entire day immersed in other people's clothing, confronting not only dirt but the intimate evidence of laboring bodies. Laundry work was physically punishing. Water had to be hauled, fires maintained, fabric scrubbed, boiled, wrung, dried, folded. Hands cracked from chemicals and cold. Backs ached from lifting. Steam filled rooms thickly enough to blur vision. Yet laundresses occupied a strangely important place in the battle against infestation. They stood at the edge between contamination and restoration. A properly boiled wash could destroy lice and eggs. But achieving that required fuel, equipment, time, and labor many households could not independently sustain. The hidden labor behind cleanliness becomes impossible to ignore once you look closely enough. And even then, victory was uncertain. In many industrial cities, cheap lodging houses developed terrible reputations for infestation. Migrant workers, travelers, dock laborers, and the unemployed moved constantly through these spaces. Beds might be rented by the night or even by portions of the night. Ventilation was poor. Bedding turnover was rapid. Owners often prioritized profit over sanitation. Middle-class reformers visiting such places were frequently horrified. Yet their horror sometimes revealed another contradiction. Industrial economies depended on masses of poorly paid workers, while simultaneously condemning the conditions those workers were forced to endure. Again and again, the history of lice leads quietly back to economics. Who could afford spare clothing? Who had servants? Who had access to hot water? Who had enough space to separate sleeping bodies? Who controlled fuel supplies? Who had leisure to wash thoroughly? These questions mattered as much as personal habits. And sometimes the divide between classes narrowed unexpectedly. Even elite households could struggle during travel, war, political upheaval, or epidemic crisis. Aristocrats fleeing conflict might suddenly experience crowded roads and uncertain lodgings. Officers in military campaigns discovered that rank did not fully protect the body from insects. Expeditions into remote regions exposed explorers, administrators, missionaries, and merchants to the same physical vulnerabilities long familiar to ordinary people. This is one reason lice occupy such an interesting place in history. They cut across narratives of status. Wealth reduced risk enormously, but it did not erase human biology. Under pressure, even privilege became porous. By the late 19th century, however, something slowly began to shift in parts of the industrialized world. Not all at once, and not evenly, but steadily enough to matter. Urban sanitation projects expanded. Public bathhouses appeared. Soap manufacturing industrialized. Water systems improved. Cotton clothing became more widely available. Laundry technologies advanced gradually. Germ theory transformed medical understanding. Perhaps most importantly, governments and reformers increasingly began treating public hygiene as a collective responsibility rather than purely an individual moral issue. This was not simple altruism. Epidemics frightened authorities. Armies weakened by disease alarmed military planners. Industrial productivity suffered when workers were chronically ill. Public health emerged partly from compassion and partly from fear. But regardless of motive, the effects slowly changed daily life. The modern expectation that clothing should routinely be washed, changed, and separated from infestation was historically unusual. It depended on infrastructure invisible to most people today. Plumbing, detergents, heated water, sewage systems, machine manufacturing, affordable fabric production, and stable housing conditions. Without those systems, the old world lingered very easily. And in some places, it lingered brutally into the 20th century. During the First World War, millions of soldiers once again found themselves trapped in environments almost perfectly suited to body lice. Trenches combined mud, crowding, dampness, exhaustion, and limited washing opportunities into a continuous physical ordeal. Soldiers described the insects with a mixture of disgust, humor, and fatalism. Many referred to them simply as cooties, using humor to soften an experience otherwise difficult to control. But beneath the jokes sat genuine misery. Men scratched constantly. Seams crawled visibly. Clothing became infested so thoroughly that some soldiers claimed they could hear faint crackling sounds when lice eggs burst near fires. Whether fully accurate or slightly exaggerated through memory, such descriptions captured the psychological intensity of prolonged infestation. And worse still, trench fever spread through lice-infested conditions, weakening enormous numbers of soldiers without always killing them outright. Men developed pain, fever, exhaustion, and recurring illness that drained military effectiveness slowly and persistently. This was another uncomfortable historical lesson. Wars were not shaped only by bullets and artillery. Sometimes they were shaped by insects hidden inside uniforms. Military authorities attempted responses. Delousing stations were established. Clothing was steamed. Men passed through organized cleaning procedures when possible. Chemical treatments improved over time. Yet the scale of industrial war overwhelmed many efforts. There is something deeply humbling in this. Entire nations mobilized factories, railways, artillery, and modern science. Yet individual soldiers still found themselves sitting in muddy trenches scratching desperately beneath their collars. And for civilians caught in war zones, refugee crises, prisons, and forced migrations, the danger could become even worse. Because once social systems collapsed far enough, the old relationship between crowding, clothing, parasites, and disease returned with terrifying speed. Which is why, in the decades that followed, governments, militaries, and public health officials became increasingly determined to control infestation not simply as a matter of comfort, but as part of managing entire populations under stress. And that determination would eventually produce one of the strangest transformations in the history of everyday life: the gradual disappearance of a problem that earlier generations had once considered nearly permanent. But disappearance did not happen cleanly or all at once. In the early 20th century, many public health campaigns approached lice with a language that mixed science, military discipline, and social anxiety together in uncomfortable ways. Posters warned citizens about hygiene. Officials inspected immigrants at borders. School children underwent examinations. Prisoners, soldiers, refugees, factory workers, and the homeless were processed through increasingly organized systems of washing and delousing. At one level, this represented genuine medical progress. Authorities now understood far more clearly that lice could spread deadly disease. Delousing stations saved lives. Improved sanitation reduced suffering. Mass laundering programs, hot baths, disinfectants, and steam treatments could interrupt epidemics that would once have swept through entire populations. But there was another side to this story as well. Because whenever governments begin categorizing bodies according to cleanliness, danger, and contamination, the language of hygiene can begin to blur into the language of control. This became especially visible during periods of political upheaval and mass displacement. Refugee camps, detention centers, prisons, and military transit stations all relied heavily on delousing procedures. People arriving exhausted from war or migration were often ordered to strip, surrender clothing, pass through showers, and submit to chemical treatments while officials processed garments separately. Some experienced this as relief. Others experienced it as humiliation. Often it was both at once. For modern listeners, it can be difficult to imagine how emotionally exposed clothing really was in earlier eras. Garments were intimate possessions. They carried smell, labor, identity, and survival. To have one's clothes confiscated, boiled, fumigated, or burned could feel deeply destabilizing, even when medically justified. And clothing itself still represented enormous material value. A poor family fleeing conflict might own little beyond what they could wear. If infested garments were destroyed, replacing them was not always simple. The body, meanwhile, remained caught between vulnerability and necessity. One revealing detail from early 20th century accounts is how frequently people describe scratching almost unconsciously. Soldiers writing letters home, children in crowded districts, prisoners in camps, workers in temporary housing. Again and again, the act becomes automatic. Fingers moving beneath collars during conversation. nails pressing against the waistline during pauses in labor, sleep interrupted by irritation that never fully stopped. Over time, prolonged infestation could alter posture, mood, and behavior. Chronic discomfort narrows the world. It changes concentration. It erodes patience. It creates a low-level tension that never entirely disappears. This is one of the hidden realities historians increasingly try to recover. Ordinary physical suffering shaped human experience constantly, even when political history ignored it. A diplomat negotiating treaties might still be sleeping badly in lousy bedding during travel. A labor organizer speaking at meetings might be wearing the same underclothes repeatedly through long factory shifts. A refugee mother comforting children might herself be tormented by exhaustion, itching, and anxiety over contamination. History often appears clean in retrospect because archives preserve official decisions more easily than bodily discomfort. But the body never stopped mattering. And nowhere was this more horrifyingly visible than during the great catastrophes of the 20th century, when lice became intertwined with some of the darkest environments human beings ever created. In concentration camps, prison camps, ghettos, forced labor compounds, and overcrowded detention systems during the Second World War, lice returned with terrible force. Overcrowding, starvation, inadequate washing facilities, exhausted immune systems, and limited access to clean clothing created conditions under which infestation spread rapidly. Survivor testimonies frequently mention lice not as a secondary detail, but as part of the structure of daily existence itself. People scratched until skin broke open. Clothing became saturated with sweat and fear. Nights offered little rest. Delousing procedures were feared because they could signal transport, punishment, separation, or worse. Sometimes shaving, chemical exposure, and confiscation of belongings were experienced not as care, but as another stage of dehumanization. This is one reason historians must approach the subject carefully. Lice themselves are biologically simple creatures, but historically, they exist inside systems of poverty, war, humiliation, migration, imprisonment, and power, and sometimes the language surrounding infestation became morally dangerous. Throughout history, political regimes occasionally described unwanted populations as verminous or contaminating. These metaphors were never merely descriptive. They encouraged people to associate human beings with infestation itself. Once that connection hardened psychologically, cruelty became easier to justify. The history of lice therefore intersects uneasily with the history of propaganda and dehumanization. At the same time, however, there were also moments of extraordinary care hidden inside these harsh conditions. Nurses washed patients painstakingly despite shortages. Family members searched children's clothing seam by seam. Aid workers established laundries in refugee zones. Prisoners shared precious soap. Soldiers helped one another boil uniforms when fuel became available. Even in severe hardship, people tried to restore dignity through cleanliness whenever they could. That effort tells us something important. Hygiene was never only about avoiding disease. It was also about recovering personhood. To wash, to change clothes, to sleep in clean bedding, to stop scratching for one night. These experiences could feel profoundly emotional after long deprivation. Modern comfort is so continuous for many people that it becomes invisible. But historical moments of cleanliness often stood out sharply precisely because discomfort had been so constant. After the Second World War, several developments began accelerating the decline of body lice in many industrialized countries. Synthetic insecticides became widely used. Housing standards improved gradually in some regions. Washing machines spread into domestic life. Commercial detergents became more accessible. Hot water systems expanded. Clothing production became cheaper and faster. People owned more garments and washed them more frequently. This combination altered the relationship between humans and cloth in a historically unprecedented way. For most of human history, clothing had been relatively scarce, repaired repeatedly, and worn for long periods between deep cleaning. Now, increasingly, garments could be mass-produced, regularly laundered, and replaced more easily. The rhythm of daily life changed with them, and with that change came a subtle shift in psychological expectations. Earlier generations often expected some level of bodily discomfort as ordinary. Modern societies increasingly began expecting its absence. Itching, odor, infestation, and visible parasites moved from familiar hardship to shocking exception. This transition happened so gradually that many people barely noticed it occurring. By the late 20th century, in wealthier countries at least, body lice had become associated mainly with extreme poverty, displacement, homelessness, war zones, or institutional neglect. Entire generations grew up without directly encountering them. As a result, historical descriptions that once sounded mundane began sounding almost unreal. Yet the disappearance was uneven. In refugee crises, disaster zones, prisons, and impoverished regions, the old conditions could still return very quickly. Human biology had not changed. The insect had not vanished. What changed were the systems surrounding the body: laundry infrastructure, access to water, housing density, healthcare, clothing availability, and public sanitation. And this reveals one of the deepest lessons hidden inside the subject. Civilization often feels abstract when described through governments, inventions, or empires. But one practical definition of civilization is much quieter: how difficult it is for parasites to live in your clothing. That may sound almost absurd at first, yet it captures something essential. Stable infrastructure changes the texture of daily existence. It allows sleep without constant vigilance. It allows garments to remain merely garments rather than habitats. The people who lived before these systems were not weaker, dirtier, or less intelligent than modern people. They simply inhabited environments where maintaining bodily comfort demanded enormous labor. And even then, success was fragile. Consider, for a moment, the amount of invisible infrastructure required for a modern person to casually toss clothes into a washing machine. Reliable water delivery, sewage removal, industrial detergent production, electrification, factory-made textiles, transportation networks, stable housing, heating systems, time outside survival labor. Remove enough of those layers, and the older world begins creeping back surprisingly fast. This became visible after natural disasters and during wartime disruptions, even in advanced societies. Refugee shelters grew crowded. Water systems failed. Laundry access disappeared. Clean changes of clothing became limited. Public health officials monitored infestation carefully because they understood how rapidly conditions could deteriorate once ordinary routines collapsed. There is something quietly humbling in that realization. Modern comfort often feels permanent because it surrounds us constantly. But historically speaking, it is extraordinarily recent. And this is why historical empathy matters here. It is easy to hear about lice and imagine only disgust. Harder, but more valuable, is recognizing how much endurance ordinary people carried through ordinary days. A medieval mother trying to keep children clean beside a smoky hearth. A sailor sleeping in cramped quarters for months at sea. A factory laborer washing one shirt repeatedly after exhausting shifts. A trench soldier heating seams over a candle flame. A refugee guarding the last wearable coat in winter. These are not stories of failure. They are stories of adaptation inside material limits. The closer historians look at daily life, the more they discover that comfort itself has a history. So does privacy. So does cleanliness. So does sleep. Even scratching has a history. And perhaps that is why the subject lingers so powerfully once examined closely. It transforms history from distant spectacle into physical reality. Kings, workers, soldiers, servants, migrants, prisoners, and travelers all inhabited vulnerable bodies. Clothing protected them from weather and exposure, yet sometimes betrayed them by sheltering something else as well. That contradiction followed humanity for centuries. In naval history especially, the problem became nearly legendary. Long voyages trapped crews together in damp, crowded wooden worlds where fresh clothing and proper washing were severely limited. Sailors often slept in hammocks slung close together, surrounded by salt air, sweat, and continuously reused fabric. Uniform regulations existed, but practical reality frequently overrode ideal standards. And ships created another strange problem. Even when seawater was plentiful, fresh water was precious. Fresh water had to be rationed carefully for drinking and cooking. Extensive laundering was not always feasible. Saltwater washing could help somewhat, but it also stiffened fabric and irritated skin. Damp clothing dried slowly below deck. Mildew and odor accumulated. The body remained trapped inside layers of reused cloth, moving through heat, storms, confinement, and fatigue. So once again, the ordinary act of wearing clothing became more complicated than it first appeared. And among sailors, as among soldiers, humor became one way of enduring the situation. Nicknames emerged for Lice. Complaints became jokes. Men mocked each other's scratching. Exaggerated stories circulated during long voyages. But humor in harsh conditions often signals not comfort, but the absence of alternatives. Because beneath the jokes remained the same ancient problem. Bodies confined together, garments worn too long, and the persistent life hidden inside the seams. And on those ships, perhaps more clearly than anywhere else, people discovered how thin the boundary could be between civilization and discomfort. A vessel crossing the Atlantic in the 17th or 18th century was not merely a machine of exploration or trade. It was a floating environment of compressed human existence. Sailors worked, slept, fought, ate, sweated, healed, and decayed within timber walls that trapped moisture and smell with astonishing efficiency. Clothing rarely became fully fresh. Fabric absorbed salt, smoke from galley fires, tar, body odor, and dampness from sea air that seemed to creep into every thread. Even officers with better quarters were not entirely insulated from the physical realities below deck. Rank altered space and diet, but not basic biology. And because voyages often lasted months, small irritations accumulated into permanent conditions. One of the quiet misunderstandings modern audiences often carry about the past is the assumption that discomfort arrives dramatically. In reality, historical suffering was frequently repetitive rather than catastrophic. The same itching every evening, the same scratching upon waking, the same careful inspection of seams under weak lantern light, the same stale shirt pulled reluctantly over tired skin each morning. Repetition wears the mind differently than crisis. This is why sailors' memoirs and naval journals sometimes mention lice almost casually, buried among storms, discipline, and navigation. The insects had become part of the texture of existence at sea. Complaining endlessly served little purpose. Men adapted psychologically because they had no practical alternative. And adaptation often produced its own strange culture. Experienced sailors developed practical habits that newcomers learned quickly. Clothing might be aired whenever weather allowed. Hammocks were inspected. Garments were occasionally baked near heat sources or exposed to strong sunlight when ships entered warmer climates. Some men shaved body hair partly for comfort and partly to reduce infestation. Others carried small personal routines that bordered on ritual, repeating them not because they guaranteed success, but because routine itself restored a sense of control. Control mattered deeply in environments where so much else could not be controlled. Storms arrived unexpectedly. Food spoiled. Water stagnated. Discipline could be brutal. Disease spread rapidly. Against that background, managing one's clothing became a small act of personal order. And for many sailors, the relationship between cleanliness and morale became increasingly obvious. Officers learned that crews forced to live in unbearable conditions grew weaker, sicker, and more volatile. Naval reforms gradually emphasized ventilation, laundering, and hygiene not simply from compassion, but from practical necessity. An exhausted, feverish, lousy crew could not operate a ship effectively. Once again, the history of Lice reveals a larger truth hiding beneath the surface. Institutions often improved sanitation not because comfort suddenly became morally important, but because unhealthy bodies disrupted systems of power, labor, and war. Factories discovered the same lesson. By the 19th century, industrial labor had transformed the rhythms of daily life across much of Europe and North America. Urban workers now spent long hours in mills, foundries, mines, and workshops where heat, dust, sweat, and overcrowding created new physical pressures. Clothing absorbed industrial life as thoroughly as it once absorbed agricultural life. A miner emerging from underground after a long shift carried coal dust into fabric fibers. Textile workers inhaled lint that settled into garments and bedding alike. Foundry workers sweated through heavy clothes near furnaces. Laundering these garments required time and energy often already exhausted by labor itself. And unlike romantic paintings of industrial progress, the reality of many working-class districts was physically exhausting in nearly every direction. Streets crowded with smoke, shared courtyards, water pumps serving multiple households, long queues at public washhouses, children sleeping close together because space was limited. Body lice did not emerge from some mysterious moral failing within these communities. They emerged because industrial growth frequently advanced faster than humane living conditions. Reformers slowly began documenting this imbalance. Social investigators entered tenements and boarding houses, recording how many people occupied single rooms, how often bedding was changed, how laundry was managed, and how infestation spread. Some accounts were compassionate. Others carried a tone of shocked superiority. But together they revealed a world where the battle for cleanliness consumed enormous effort. The laundress became one of the defining figures of this hidden history. There is something almost symbolic about her role. Bent over steaming tubs, lifting heavy wet fabric, scrubbing collars and seams, she stood at the intersection between the human body and the industrial city. Her labor pushed back, however temporarily, against the accumulation of sweat, odor, disease, and parasites. Yet laundry itself could be dangerous work. Constant exposure to dampness damaged lungs and joints. Hot water scalded skin. Chemicals irritated hands raw. Long hours bent over washing surfaces produced chronic pain. And still, despite all that labor, garments could become reinfested astonishingly quickly once returned to overcrowded homes. The victory was never permanent. That temporary quality shaped people's emotional relationship with cleanliness in ways modern audiences rarely consider. Today, many people expect hygiene to remain stable unless interrupted. In the past, cleanliness often felt fragile and temporary from the beginning. A washed shirt was not the end of a problem. It was a brief reprieve from it. This perhaps explains why fresh clothing carried such emotional weight historically. Letters, diaries, and memoirs often mention clean linen with almost surprising tenderness. Soldiers described the pleasure of dry socks and washed shirts. Travelers remembered fresh bedding vividly. Poor families reserved better garments for Sundays, holidays, or church services. Clean cloth did not merely improve appearance. It transformed how the body experienced the world. For one evening, perhaps, the scratching lessened. The smell of soap replaced the smell of labor. Sleep became easier. And sleep itself is another overlooked part of this story. Body lice were creatures of interruption. They broke continuity. They disturbed rest repeatedly across nights, weeks, and years. A person living with infestation rarely experienced full bodily peace. There was always the possibility of another bite, another itch, another movement beneath fabric. The psychological effect of this should not be underestimated. Modern sleep research increasingly shows how deeply interrupted rest affects mood, concentration, immunity, and emotional resilience. Historical populations, already carrying burdens of hard labor and disease, often endured chronic disturbances modern people would find intolerable. Yet they normalized them because normalization is one of humanity's most powerful survival tools. Children born into these environments learned expectations early. They learned which garments itched more. They learned how to scratch discreetly in public. They learned which corners of bedding felt safest. They learned household routines for boiling linen or inspecting seams. To them, these habits were not historical curiosities. They were ordinary knowledge. And ordinary knowledge often disappears most completely from historical memory. Kings leave portraits. Governments leave laws. Generals leave battle reports. But the millions of tiny gestures people use to manage discomfort often vanish unless someone deliberately records them. Occasionally, however, a small detail survives that suddenly restores physical reality to the past. A prison account describing inmates warming seams over candles to kill lice eggs. A schoolchild remembering classmates lined up for inspections. A refugee describing the shame of removing infested clothing before strangers. A soldier writing home about scratching until his skin bled through wool. These fragments matter because they resist romanticization. Historical life was not uniformly miserable, of course. People laughed, celebrated, loved, built families, and found beauty even in harsh environments. But comfort was less guaranteed. Privacy was thinner. The body remained more exposed to weather, crowding, insects, and physical strain. And perhaps nowhere was this clearer than among those who lacked stable shelter altogether. Homelessness in earlier centuries often carried dangers modern societies only partly understand. Without secure access to washing facilities, storage, spare clothing, or regular bedding, infestation became extremely difficult to avoid. Shelters and lodging houses could offer temporary relief while simultaneously concentrating vulnerability. A clean garment might become infested in a single night spent among crowded sleepers. This produced a cruel cycle. Infestation increased social stigma. Stigma reduced employment opportunities and social acceptance. Reduced stability made hygiene harder to maintain. The problem reinforced itself materially and psychologically. Again, lice became not just a biological issue, but a social marker. And yet, historical observers sometimes misunderstood what they were truly seeing. They saw insects and concluded moral decay. They saw scratching and concluded laziness. They saw ragged clothing and concluded personal failure. What they often failed to see was exhaustion. Exhaustion from carrying water. Exhaustion from labor. Exhaustion from overcrowding. Exhaustion from poverty. Exhaustion from trying repeatedly to solve problems larger than any individual could solve alone. The modern world occasionally forgets how much infrastructure silently protects bodily dignity. Consider the simple modern act of changing clothes after a hot day. Behind it stands industrial textile production, affordable detergents, electrical appliances, climate-controlled interiors, piped water, sewage treatment, and enough spare garments to rotate them casually. Earlier societies possessed some of these pieces, but rarely all of them together at scale. And because those systems were incomplete, clothing remained biologically active in ways unfamiliar to many people now. Even seasonal changes shaped infestation patterns. Winter posed particular difficulties. Heavy clothing was harder to wash and dry. Families crowded closer together indoors. Fires consumed valuable fuel. Removing garments fully in freezing conditions could itself become dangerous. Summer brought sweat and faster bacterial growth. Armies campaigning in heat struggled constantly against bodily deterioration. Weather once again entered directly into intimate life. There is something profoundly grounding about this realization. History is often taught through ideology, invention, and political change. Yet ordinary human experience remained deeply dependent on temperature, water access, cloth quality, housing density, and parasites small enough to hide inside stitching. And stitching itself mattered enormously. Body lice preferred seams because seams provided shelter. This led people to inspect collars, cuffs, waistbands, and folded joins with extraordinary care. Tailoring choices unintentionally shaped where infestation gathered. Thick military uniforms, layered winter garments, and heavily stitched work clothes all created hiding places difficult to clean thoroughly without heat or boiling. Some historical garments were even designed with laundering realities in mind. Removable linen layers, washable undergarments, and interchangeable cuffs existed partly because deep cleaning entire outfits frequently was impractical. Fashion, hygiene, and economics constantly overlapped, which creates another subtle reversal in the story. Modern people often assume earlier clothing was simpler than ours. In some ways, it was more complicated precisely because it had to compensate for harsher living conditions. Layers served multiple purposes at once: warmth, modesty, status, protection, and partial hygiene management. But despite all these adaptations, there were moments when the balance simply collapsed. Famine years, refugee movements, sieges, prison overcrowding, long military retreats, forced migrations, economic depressions. Whenever social systems broke under pressure, lice returned rapidly and visibly. Public health officials learned this repeatedly across centuries. Remove stability, and the old biological realities resurfaced almost immediately. And so by the middle decades of the 20th century, governments, militaries, and aid organizations increasingly treated delousing not as a minor detail, but as an essential part of crisis management itself, because they understood something earlier generations had learned through bitter experience. Once clothing becomes impossible to keep clean, far larger forms of suffering are usually already close behind. Because they understood something earlier generations had learned through bitter experience. Once clothing becomes impossible to keep clean, far larger forms of suffering are usually already close behind. That relationship appeared again and again across history with almost unsettling consistency. Long before statistics or epidemiology existed in modern form, people sensed that infestation rarely arrived alone. It traveled with hunger, crowding, displacement, exhaustion, and institutional breakdown. A lousy population was often a population under pressure. And pressure leaves marks not only on societies, but on the body itself. One detail physicians and observers repeatedly noticed in heavily infested communities was the way chronic scratching altered skin over time. The body adapted visibly to long irritation. Skin thickened, darkened, scarred. Small wounds reopened again and again beneath fingernails. In severe cases, people carried the evidence of infestation almost permanently, like traces of labor etched into the hands of a craftsman. This is another aspect modern audiences sometimes miss. Historical discomfort was often cumulative rather than isolated. A single bite is irritating. Thousands over months or years become something else entirely. The body changes in response. Sleep changes, mood changes, self-consciousness changes, and because these experiences were widespread, societies developed emotional customs around them. People learned how to speak about infestation indirectly. Euphemisms emerged. Humor softened embarrassment. Certain gestures became socially recognizable without needing explanation. Someone scratching discreetly beneath a sleeve might pass unnoticed because everyone understood the impulse already. At times, this normalization became so complete that outsiders were shocked by what insiders accepted as routine. Travel narratives from wealthier or cleaner regions often contain moments of startled observation. Visitors described inns alive with insects, barracks thick with odor, crowded city districts where laundry hung constantly between buildings yet never seemed sufficient. Some observers exaggerated for dramatic effect, certainly, but many were encountering a genuine reality gap between environments with stronger sanitation systems and those without them. And sanitation itself was uneven in remarkably complicated ways. A wealthy district could exist only streets away from severe overcrowding. A royal palace might maintain elaborate laundry services while nearby laborers lacked reliable water access. Naval officers could dine formally above decks while sailors below scratched through damp uniforms. Industrial prosperity often existed beside industrial misery almost simultaneously. The same century that produced refined fashion, polished silverware, and elegant drawing rooms also produced cramped urban basements where entire families fought constantly against infestation. This contradiction matters because it prevents the past from becoming too simple. It is tempting to imagine history as a clean progression from dirty to clean, primitive to modern. But reality moved unevenly. Improvements appeared first in certain places, among certain classes, under certain conditions. One generation might experience enormous advances while another remained trapped in older material realities. Even within the same household, experiences differed sharply. Servants, for example, occupied an especially difficult position in many societies. Domestic service often required maintaining the visible cleanliness and comfort of wealthier households while living under harsher conditions personally. A maid might carefully prepare fresh linens for her employers while sleeping in cramped attic quarters herself. A valet could brush and maintain expensive garments while worrying privately about infestation in his own belongings. And because service work depended heavily on appearance, bodily management became professionally important. To appear dirty, scratched, or infested could threaten employment. Yet avoiding those conditions completely was not always within a servant's control. Shared lodging, reused bedding, long working hours, and limited privacy complicated everything. Again, the history of lice keeps returning to the same hidden structure. The body was never purely personal. It was shaped continuously by housing, labor, class, infrastructure, and access. This is why public bathhouses became so significant in many urban societies. For people without private facilities, bathhouses offered something larger than hygiene alone. They provided temporary access to warmth, water, steam, and relief from bodily accumulation. Clothes could sometimes be cleaned or treated at the same time. In some cities, reformers promoted public bathing partly as moral improvement, partly as disease prevention, and partly as social stabilization. The language surrounding these reforms could be patronizing. Officials often spoke about disciplining the poor into cleanliness. Yet beneath the paternalism sat a practical truth. When ordinary people gained reliable access to washing facilities, infestation rates genuinely declined. Infrastructure altered daily life more effectively than lectures ever could. Still, even successful reforms struggled against deeper economic realities. During recessions, wars, or housing shortages, conditions could deteriorate rapidly. The gains of one decade might weaken during the next crisis. This instability became painfully visible during the Great Depression, when millions faced unemployment, migration, and insecure housing across multiple countries. For families already living close to material limits, economic collapse threatened hygiene first through small disruptions. Soap became something to conserve. Fuel for boiling water became expensive. Clothing wore thinner. Laundry was postponed. Children shared beds more frequently. Boarding arrangements multiplied. None of these changes alone guaranteed infestation. Together, however, they recreated older vulnerabilities remarkably quickly. And this is one reason historians increasingly study the history of everyday maintenance. Large political events matter enormously, of course, but societies also survive through millions of repetitive domestic actions. Washing, mending, boiling, drying, brushing, airing, cleaning. When those systems weaken, the consequences ripple outward through health, morale, and dignity alike. The history of soldiers during long campaigns illustrates this almost perfectly. Military archives often focus on strategy and movement, yet soldiers themselves frequently remembered campaigns through bodily details instead. Wet boots, frozen blankets, rotting food, dirty water, and again, insects. A campaign season might involve weeks without proper laundering opportunities. Men slept in uniforms stiff with sweat and mud. Clothing became heavy, abrasive, and biologically active. Diaries describe men stripping during rare pauses to inspect seams in groups, searching methodically while trading complaints or crude jokes. The social ritual mattered almost as much as the practical result. Shared suffering created community. Scratching ceased to be embarrassing because everyone participated. Men compared methods for killing lice. Fires became gathering points not merely for warmth but for desperate maintenance. In some armies, soldiers passed clothing quickly over flames, listening for the faint popping sounds sometimes attributed to heated lice eggs. Whether every account was literally accurate mattered less than the atmosphere those descriptions conveyed. The body remained under siege even far from combat itself. And in prisoner of war camps, conditions often became worse. Crowded compounds with insufficient washing facilities created ideal environments for infestation. Prisoners weakened by malnutrition struggled to maintain even minimal hygiene. Clothing deteriorated physically. Blankets circulated repeatedly among exhausted bodies. Under such conditions, the boundary between discomfort and disease grew dangerously thin. Yet even there, people attempted to preserve fragments of order. Memoirs sometimes mention prisoners carefully cleaning collars or trading scraps of soap like precious currency. Tiny acts of maintenance became psychologically meaningful. To wash a shirt, repair a seam, or remove lice manually was to insist, however quietly, that one's body still deserved care. That emotional dimension appears repeatedly across centuries. Infestation was humiliating partly because it threatened identity. Cleanliness has long been tied to ideas of self-respect, adulthood, discipline, and social belonging. To lose control over one's clothing and body could feel deeply destabilizing. Children experienced this especially intensely in institutional settings. Schools, orphanages, and children's homes frequently conducted inspections during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Some were gentle, others were harshly shaming. Children found to be infested might be separated, publicly identified, or sent home. The emotional memory of these experiences often lasted far longer than the infestation itself. And here again, class hovered quietly in the background. Children from poorer households were more vulnerable not because their parents cared less, but because maintaining hygienic stability under poverty required exhausting effort. Crowded housing, irregular employment, insufficient heating, and limited laundry access all increased risk. Yet social judgment often ignored those structural realities. This tendency to moralize bodily conditions has appeared repeatedly throughout history. Societies frequently transform material hardship into perceived character flaws. But parasites are profoundly indifferent to moral narratives. They respond to environment, opportunity, and access. In this sense, lice acted almost like biological historians. They revealed where systems failed. Overcrowded prisons, poor military logistics, refugee crises, industrial exploitation, urban housing shortages, failing sanitation infrastructure. Wherever these conditions intensified, lice tended to follow. And when public health systems improved, they receded. By the second half of the 20th century, many people in wealthier nations began forgetting how historically normal infestation once had been. Washing machines entered ordinary homes. Central heating reduced damp indoor conditions. Synthetic fabrics changed laundering patterns. Hot showers became routine. Children grew up expecting multiple changes of clothing rather than one or two heavily reused outfits. The psychological distance from earlier centuries widened rapidly. What had once been common became almost unimaginable. This created a subtle historical illusion. Because body lice became less visible in everyday life, modern audiences sometimes assume earlier people tolerated infestation due to ignorance or indifference. In reality, most people throughout history disliked lice intensely. They fought them constantly with whatever tools, time, and resources they possessed. What changed was not human preference. It was technological and infrastructural capability. And even today, that capability remains uneven globally. In refugee camps, homeless encampments, overcrowded prisons, disaster zones, and regions destabilized by war, the old patterns still emerge with unsettling speed. Human beings displaced from stable washing facilities and reliable clothing systems quickly rediscover how fragile bodily comfort can be. Aid organizations understand this very well. Emergency responses frequently prioritize not only food and medicine, but blankets, spare clothing, laundry access, bathing facilities, and delousing measures. To outside observers, these may seem secondary concerns compared to dramatic injuries or hunger. But experienced relief workers know something history has repeatedly demonstrated. Preserving hygiene helps preserve social stability, psychological resilience, and disease control simultaneously. A clean shirt can matter enormously inside chaos. That truth would have been instantly recognizable to people centuries earlier. A sailor finally receiving fresh linen after months at sea. A refugee child bathed after weeks of flight. A soldier changing into boiled clothing after trench duty. A factory worker wearing clean garments on a rare day of rest. These moments carried emotional force precisely because the body remembered discomfort so clearly. And perhaps that is the quiet thread running through this entire history. Not merely insects, but relief. The relief of scratching less. The relief of dry fabric. The relief of warmth after washing. The relief of sleeping briefly without irritation. The relief of feeling human again after periods of exhaustion and grime. Those sensations rarely dominate official histories. Yet they shaped ordinary emotional life for millions of people across centuries. And as historians continue looking more closely at domestic routines, labor systems, military life, migration, and public health, the story keeps widening. What begins as a history of lice slowly becomes a history of vulnerability itself, of how human bodies survive inside the system societies build around them. Which is why even something as small as a shirt seam can reveal far more about the past than it first appears. A seam is a practical object. Folded cloth, thread, reinforcement where fabric meets strain. Yet for centuries, it was also one of the preferred hiding places of an entire unwanted world. That tiny fold of material connected tailors, laundresses, soldiers, servants, refugees, sailors, prisoners, children, and laborers through a shared physical reality few of them would ever have considered historically important. And perhaps that is exactly why it matters now. The history most people inherit is often a history of exceptional moments. Coronations, revolutions, battles, famous speeches. But the actual texture of human life was built from repetitive physical experiences so ordinary they rarely entered official records. Carrying water, mending cloth, scratching beneath sleeves, warming garments by firelight, turning linen inside out at the end of a long day. Once historians began paying closer attention to these routines, the past itself started changing shape. Take, for example, the simple act of sleeping. Modern sleep is usually imagined as private. A bedroom, clean sheets, predictable warmth, a mattress belonging to one person or perhaps a couple. But for much of history, sleep was social, crowded, noisy, and physically complicated. Entire families shared beds. Servants slept communally. Travelers rented spaces in shared rooms. Sailors swung in hammocks packed tightly together. Soldiers lay side by side on straw or bare ground. Under such conditions, clothing often remained partly on even during rest. Removing garments completely could mean cold, vulnerability, theft risk, or inconvenience during sudden movement. Yet keeping clothes on allowed warmth and parasites to remain close together through the night. So the body entered sleep already compromised. And because sleep is when modern people expect restoration, it is difficult to fully imagine what interrupted rest meant historically. A person waking repeatedly to scratch might still need to work 14 hours the next day. A mother caring for children through infestation still had meals to prepare. A soldier exhausted by marching still stood watch. Fatigue accumulated quietly across entire populations. This is one reason body lice belonged not just to medical history, but to the history of energy itself. How much strength did people lose to poor sleep, chronic irritation, minor infections, and constant discomfort? It is almost impossible to measure precisely, yet the effect must have been enormous. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, but adaptation does not erase cost. And cost often appeared indirectly. People grew irritable, concentration weakened, skin infections spread through repeated scratching. Small wounds became vulnerable in environments lacking reliable sanitation. In children especially, chronic discomfort could shape mood and attention in ways adults around them may never have fully understood. Yet because these conditions were widespread, societies normalized them. That normalization is deeply important to understand. Earlier people were not endlessly shocked by realities they encountered constantly. Familiar hardship becomes part of ordinary expectation. What horrifies one generation may barely surprise another if it appears often enough. This helps explain why some historical descriptions of infestation sound emotionally restrained to modern readers. Writers mention lice in passing because they were describing a familiar annoyance rather than a singular catastrophe. But beneath the casual language often lay genuine exhaustion. The emotional tone of historical sources can be deceptive that way. A sailor joking about insects in his hammock may have been deeply uncomfortable. A soldier describing cooties humorously may have been covering frustration and helplessness. Humor frequently acted as emotional insulation in environments where complaints could not change conditions. And this pattern extended beyond military or working-class life. Even elite courts and aristocratic households were not entirely free from infestation. Wealth dramatically reduced risk, certainly, through access to servants, spare clothing, bathing facilities, and better housing. Yet earlier luxury existed within biological limits still recognizable today. A noblewoman traveling for weeks over rough roads might sleep in unfamiliar inns. Royal entourages moved enormous quantities of fabric, bedding, and people together across regions. Court clothing itself could become difficult to clean thoroughly due to complexity, embroidery, heavy materials, and sheer size. Ironically, some symbols of wealth introduced their own hygienic complications. Wigs, for example, became associated with elaborate maintenance routines in parts of early modern Europe. Powder, oils, perfumes, and specialized grooming developed partly because bodily management at elite levels was already an intense social concern. Clothing and appearance signaled discipline, refinement, and status. Yet maintaining those appearances demanded extraordinary labor behind the scenes. Servants brushed fabrics constantly. Linens were changed and laundered repeatedly. Garments were aired, perfumed, repaired, and stored with care. Entire domestic systems existed partly to hold bodily disorder at bay. This reveals another hidden contradiction of the past. Luxury often depended upon invisible labor performed by people living much closer to discomfort themselves. The smooth elegance of aristocratic life rested atop armies of laundresses, maids, valets, seamstresses, and servants handling the endless material consequences of human bodies, washing sweat from collars, removing stains, inspecting bedding, managing wardrobes large enough to permit regular changes of clothing. Without that labor, even wealth became physically unstable surprisingly quickly. And because clothing carried so much practical importance, garments themselves were treated differently than modern fast fashion. Fabric represented work, money, and survival. Wool had to be sheared, spun, woven, tailored. Linen production demanded immense labor from field to finished cloth. Even simple shirts represented valuable possessions for ordinary people. This is why the advice, "just wash your clothes," would have sounded far less simple historically than it does now. Washing was not pressing a button on a machine. It meant hauling water, heating it, scrubbing by hand, wringing heavy wet cloth, drying it in uncertain weather, and hoping the fabric survived repeated treatment. Harsh boiling could damage garments over time. Soap itself cost money. Fuel cost money. Time cost energy already in short supply. Every clean shirt contained hidden labor. And because labor was limited, people developed intermediate strategies between dirty and truly clean. Clothing was brushed, aired, beaten, shaken, spot cleaned, or exposed to smoke and sunlight. Linen worn closest to the skin might be changed more often while outer layers remained in use much longer. Small domestic routines acted as compromise solutions within constrained systems. This practical intelligence is often overlooked when modern people imagine earlier hygiene. Historical populations were not unaware of bodily maintenance. In many cases, they were acutely aware of it. They simply lacked the infrastructure to enforce ideal cleanliness continuously. The distinction matters because it restores dignity to ordinary people of the past. A peasant woman washing garments in cold water beside a river understood perfectly well that cleaner clothing felt better and reduced discomfort. A soldier boiling uniforms over campfires did not need modern science to know lice mattered. A mother checking seams by candlelight was not ignorant of hygiene. She was working within material limits. And those limits could become especially severe during childhood. Children throughout history often inherited clothing from older siblings, cousins, or neighbors. Garments circulated repeatedly through families because cloth was too valuable to waste. Bedding was shared. Play occurred in crowded environments. Schools brought many bodies together for long hours. In poorer districts, keeping children continuously clean could become almost impossible despite parents' efforts. Teachers and officials sometimes interpreted infestation as parental neglect. Yet closer investigation frequently revealed overcrowding, inadequate heating, or lack of laundry access rather than indifference. Again and again, the story circles back to environment. What looks personal from a distance often proves structural when examined carefully. This became painfully visible in orphanages and institutional homes during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many such places were established with reformist or charitable intentions, yet funding shortages and overcrowding produced conditions ripe for infestation. Children slept close together. Laundry systems strained under demand. Staff struggled to maintain order with insufficient resources. Inspections became routine partly because administrators feared outbreaks and reputational damage simultaneously. And reputation mattered enormously in institutional life. Cleanliness signaled discipline. Disorder suggested failure. This symbolic power gave hygiene a moral dimension extending far beyond biology itself. Public officials often described clean institutions as civilized and infested institutions as degraded, dangerous, or irresponsible. Sometimes this rhetoric encouraged real improvements. Other times it justified harsh treatment or public shame. The emotional experience of being labeled unclean could be profound, especially for children. Many adults later remembered the humiliation of inspections more vividly than the physical itching itself. Standing in lines, having clothing checked publicly, being separated from peers, feeling marked as somehow defective because one's family lacked resources. These memories remind us that bodily discomfort and social embarrassment were tightly connected historically. The person living with lice often carried not only irritation, but fear of judgment. And yet, interestingly, there were also periods and places where infestation became so widespread that stigma weakened simply because nearly everyone shared exposure. During wars, migrations, or severe poverty, the problem became collective rather than individualized. Under such circumstances, people often spoke more openly and pragmatically about management. Soldiers traded techniques. Refugees organized washing rotations. Sailors aired hammocks together. Community sometimes emerged precisely because vulnerability was shared. This may be one reason historians studying hardship frequently encounter unexpected tenderness in difficult environments. People helped each other groom, wash, inspect clothing, boil garments, and care for children. Physical maintenance became communal because survival itself was communal. One can imagine an evening in a crowded rural cottage centuries ago. Firelight low, wet clothing hanging near heat, someone mending linen, someone else checking seams absent-mindedly while conversation drifts through the room. Outside, cold wind against the walls. Inside, exhaustion mixed with familiarity. There is hardship there, certainly, but there is also adaptation. And adaptation shaped architecture as well. Ventilation, sunlight, washing spaces, and bedding arrangements all influenced infestation levels. Some reformers gradually recognized that healthier housing mattered as much as individual behavior. Better windows, less crowding, cleaner water supplies, and improved sewage systems reduced the conditions parasites depended upon. The triumph of modern hygiene was therefore not a single invention, but a network of changes accumulating slowly together. Soap alone was insufficient. Water alone was insufficient. Education alone was insufficient. True transformation required infrastructure operating continuously across entire societies, which is why the collapse of infrastructure remains so dangerous even now. Natural disasters, wars, refugee crises, and economic breakdowns strip away those invisible protections layer by layer. Laundry becomes difficult, water unreliable, housing crowded, clothing scarce, and once those conditions align, the ancient relationship between fabric and infestation can return with surprising speed. Public health experts know this very well, which is why emergency shelters often focus intensely on bedding, bathing, and laundry systems from the beginning. These measures may appear mundane beside dramatic rescue operations, yet they help prevent entire cascades of suffering later. History taught that lesson repeatedly, often painfully. And by the late 20th century, researchers studying historical epidemics began understanding even more clearly how central lice had been to certain outbreaks. Diseases once blamed vaguely on bad air, moral weakness, or mysterious contagion increasingly revealed links to crowded clothing environments and parasitic transmission. This scientific clarity transformed historical interpretation itself. Suddenly, old military disasters looked different. Prison mortality looked different. Refugee crises looked different. The humble shirt seam once again became historically important, not because it was symbolic, but because it was biologically active in ways earlier generations only partly understood. And so historians, epidemiologists, and archaeologists alike began reconstructing a quieter history hidden beneath political events. The long struggle between human beings, their clothing, and the tiny creatures that learned to survive within it. What surprised many researchers was not simply how widespread lice had once been, but how deeply they were woven into the structure of ordinary existence. The evidence appeared everywhere once scholars started looking carefully enough. Preserved combs recovered from archaeological sites, written complaints in soldiers' journals, laundry records from estates and hospitals, public health regulations, prison inspection reports, domestic advice manuals warning families how to protect bedding and garments. Even ancient textiles occasionally carried traces of infestation embedded silently within their fibers. The past, it turned out, had always been speaking about these things. Historians had simply been trained to listen elsewhere. This shift in perspective changed the emotional texture of history itself. Earlier generations were no longer viewed only through their institutions or political achievements, but through the physical realities surrounding their bodies day after day. Suddenly, a medieval tunic became more than clothing. A barracks became more than architecture. A washhouse became more than a municipal service. Each represented part of an ongoing attempt to manage vulnerability. And vulnerability is perhaps the central theme hidden beneath the entire story. Human beings evolved to wear clothing because it expanded survival into colder climates and harsher environments. Fabric protected against weather, injury, and exposure. It allowed labor in difficult conditions and travel across vast regions. Yet the same adaptation created a sheltered ecosystem warm enough for parasites to exploit. There is something almost tragically ironic about that relationship. One of humanity's greatest tools also carried the seeds of a persistent problem. The better garments trapped warmth close to the body, the more attractive they became to creatures seeking stable conditions. Heavy winter layers, military uniforms, woolen underclothes, padded coats, all could become habitats as well as protection. And because people could not simply abandon clothing, they entered into centuries of negotiation with the consequences. That negotiation shaped domestic life constantly in ways difficult to notice from a modern distance. Consider bedding alone. In many earlier households, mattresses were stuffed with straw, wool, feathers, or other natural materials requiring regular maintenance. Mattresses were aired outdoors when weather permitted. Straw stuffing might be replaced periodically. Blankets were shaken and beaten. Bed frames inspected. Entire household rhythms revolved partly around managing dampness, smell, insects, and decay. The idea of a permanently clean sleeping environment would have seemed unrealistic to many people for most of history. Instead, cleanliness was cyclical and temporary. Beds became clean, then gradually less clean. Clothing became fresh, then slowly accumulated the marks of wear. Laundry was not a one-time solution but an endless repetition. This endlessness could become psychologically exhausting. Modern people often imagine discomfort as a problem waiting for resolution. Historical discomfort was frequently maintenance without conclusion. Fires had to be relit every day. Floors swept repeatedly, water carried constantly, clothing washed again and again, parasites removed continuously. The work never fully ended. And because it never ended, entire bodies of practical knowledge developed around efficiency and compromise. Housewives, servants, laundresses, and laborers learned which fabrics dried fastest, which weather helped airing, which storage methods reduced dampness, which soaps stretched furthest, which herbs or powders might discourage insects. Some remedies worked partially, others barely worked at all. But together they formed a culture of persistent management. There is a temptation, especially in modern discussions, to laugh at older remedies for parasites. Herbs tucked into bedding, smoke treatments, vinegar washes, sulfur compounds, strong perfumes. But behind these practices sat genuine experimentation. People observed patterns closely because they had strong incentives to do so. And occasionally, traditional methods did contain practical value. Sunlight, for example, genuinely helped reduce moisture and certain pests. Heat treatments could kill lice and eggs. Frequent linen changes mattered enormously. Isolation of infested bedding could slow spread. Even simple airing improved conditions somewhat in damp interiors. The problem was rarely complete ignorance. More often, it was insufficient resources to apply solutions consistently. This becomes especially clear when examining hospitals before modern sanitation reforms. Early hospitals often struggled terribly with infestation because they concentrated vulnerable bodies together under conditions difficult to control. Bedding circulated among patients. Laundry systems became overwhelmed. Ventilation remained poor. Staff numbers were limited. The sick, already weakened physically, became even more susceptible to irritation and disease. Yet hospitals also became laboratories for improving hygiene practices. As medical understanding evolved through the 18th and 19th centuries, physicians increasingly recognized that cleanliness influenced recovery. Fresh linen, washed bedding, ventilation, and regular bathing slowly gained greater importance within institutional care. Florence Nightingale's emphasis on sanitation during the Crimean War, for instance, reflected not merely abstract cleanliness ideals but practical observations about how environment affected survival. Again, the story widens. Lice themselves were only one piece of a much larger realization. Bodies cannot remain healthy in degrading surroundings indefinitely. This realization gradually transformed military thinking as well. Earlier commanders often accepted sickness and infestation almost fatalistically, assuming armies naturally deteriorated during campaigns. But modernizing states began understanding that sanitation could influence military effectiveness nearly as much as tactics. Uniform design changed. Delousing procedures expanded. Laundry systems became more organized. Field hospitals improved hygiene standards. Military planners recognized that a soldier constantly exhausted by itching, fever, or poor sleep was less effective long before reaching actual combat. And perhaps nowhere was this lesson learned more intensely than in trench warfare during the First World War. The trenches represented a kind of compressed historical nightmare for bodily maintenance. Mud, dampness, overcrowding, rats, lice, rotting clothing, and endless exhaustion combined into an environment where ordinary hygiene became nearly impossible. Soldiers often wore the same garments continuously for long periods while moisture seeped into every layer. Letters from the front repeatedly described men removing shirts to hunt lice during rare quiet moments. Some soldiers referred to chatting, a slang term for sitting together, while picking lice from seams and crushing them manually. The practice became almost social because everyone shared the same condition. There is something strangely intimate about that image. Not heroic charges, not grand speeches, just tired young men crouched together in muddy light, searching through fabric because discomfort had become unavoidable. And those moments matter historically because they resist romantic myths about war. They remind us that military life was often governed less by glory than by maintenance. Maintaining boots, maintaining rifles, maintaining clothing, maintaining bodies. Without maintenance, everything deteriorated. This principle extended beyond war into industrial modernity itself. Factories relied upon bodies arriving daily capable of labor. Schools relied upon children healthy enough to attend. Cities relied upon populations not overwhelmed by epidemic disease. Gradually, governments began seeing hygiene not merely as private virtue, but as public infrastructure essential to economic and political stability. This transformation reshaped urban planning profoundly. Sewage systems expanded. Public water supplies improved. Building codes evolved. Municipal laundries and bathhouses appeared in some regions. Housing reform movements fought for ventilation and reduced overcrowding. The modern city slowly emerged partly through attempts to separate human beings from the environmental conditions parasites preferred. Yet even as progress advanced, memory faded. By the later 20th century, many middle-class households in industrialized countries no longer thought much about the biological relationship between clothing and disease. Laundry became mechanized and routine. Multiple outfit changes became ordinary. Mattresses and fabrics changed materially. Indoor heating stabilized temperatures year-round. Comfort became normalized. And when comfort becomes normalized, people often reinterpret earlier suffering as evidence of personal failure rather than structural limitation. This is why the history of lice remains unexpectedly relevant. It reminds us how quickly moral judgment can attach itself to material conditions. A person lacking clean clothing today may still face assumptions about character rather than questions about housing, poverty, displacement, mental health, or institutional breakdown. History encourages a more careful view. Throughout centuries, infestation usually spread most aggressively where people lost control over their environments. War zones, refugee camps, workhouses, ships, barracks, factories, prisons, overcrowded tenements. The pattern remained remarkably consistent because the underlying biology remained constant. And biology has little interest in social status or moral worth. A louse does not distinguish between a peasant fleeing famine and a soldier serving an empire. It responds to warmth, proximity, and cloth. This indifference is one reason infestation repeatedly crossed social boundaries during periods of crisis. Even the wealthy could discover how fragile their protections truly were when infrastructure collapsed around them. There are accounts from wartime evacuations and forced migrations in which formerly comfortable families encountered infestation for the first time after losing stable housing, laundry access, and regular clothing changes. The experience was often deeply shocking precisely because it revealed how much modern comfort depended on systems previously taken for granted. And that realization continues into the present. Humanitarian organizations today still treat clothing and bedding as critical components of survival during crises. Emergency blankets, laundry facilities, sanitation stations, and access to clean garments help preserve not only physical health but psychological stability. People recovering from displacement often describe receiving clean clothes as emotionally overwhelming because the experience restores a sense of normality and identity. Again, the subject returns quietly to dignity. Clothing sits directly against the body. It carries smell, temperature, memory, labor, and self-image. When clothing becomes associated with infestation, the body itself can begin to feel compromised. When clothing becomes clean again, people often describe relief in emotional terms rather than purely physical ones. That emotional dimension appears throughout historical testimony once you start noticing it. A prisoner remembering the joy of fresh underwear after months of deprivation. A child recalling clean bedding during illness. a sailor describing the pleasure of dry clothes after storms, a factory worker saving a better shirt for Sundays because it briefly transformed how life felt. These moments were small, but not insignificant. In fact, one could argue that history itself is partly shaped by the accumulation of such small bodily experiences. Comfort encourages patience. Exhaustion narrows tolerance. Chronic irritation alters mood and resilience. The physical environment surrounding populations influences how societies function at every level. Yet traditional history often overlooked these intimate realities because they seemed too ordinary. Only recently have historians begun asking deeper questions about the sensory experience of the past. What did people smell constantly? How often were they cold? How much privacy existed? How clean did fabrics feel? How did interrupted sleep shape emotion? What did crowded bodies do to social behavior? Lice belong naturally inside those questions because they occupied such a persistent place within human environments for so long. And archaeologists have even begun tracing parasite histories biologically through preserved remains, textiles, and combs. Tiny fragments of evidence reveal migration patterns, living conditions, and health environments across centuries. In a strange way, the parasite becomes an accidental historical witness. It records proximity. It records crowding. It records the material conditions under which people actually lived rather than how later generations preferred to imagine they lived, which can be surprisingly unsettling. Many modern depictions of historical life soften physical discomfort unconsciously. Films show beautifully weathered clothing but rarely the persistent labor required to maintain it. Historical dramas display elegant uniforms while omitting the smells, scratching, and exhaustion inside them. Even museum displays often isolate garments from the bodily realities that once accompanied them. But the original wearers could never fully separate the two. A wool coat was warmth, status, expense, labor, smell, maintenance, and potential infestation simultaneously. A linen shirt was comfort, cleanliness, labor, vulnerability, and protection at once. And hidden inside those layers, throughout much of human history, lived an entire unseen struggle most people now barely remember at all. It is easy, from a modern distance, to underestimate how invisible the problem could become even to the people experiencing it. Not because lice were unnoticed, but because the human mind gradually learns to filter what it cannot fully escape. A worker focused on surviving winter, feeding children, or enduring military service could not spend every waking moment emotionally reacting to the insects in a shirt seam. Life demanded attention elsewhere, and so discomfort settled into the background of consciousness. This may be one of the strangest aspects of historical life for modern audiences to grasp. Many earlier people did not expect constant physical ease. They expected fluctuation. Cold in winter, heat in summer, smoke indoors, damp shoes, rough fabrics, minor pain, interrupted sleep. Bodily inconvenience was not necessarily interpreted as a crisis requiring immediate elimination. That does not mean people enjoyed these conditions. Far from it. But expectation shapes experience profoundly. When irritation becomes woven into ordinary life, the emotional response changes from shock to endurance. This endurance appears constantly in letters and memoirs once you begin looking for it. A frontiersman describing clothing stiff with sweat and smoke after months of travel. A domestic servant noting endless laundry work without dramatic complaint. A child remembering winter garments that itched constantly against the skin. A miner writing about the relief of finally changing clothes after long shifts underground. The remarkable thing is not simply that people endured such conditions, but that they still built meaningful lives within them. This is where the history becomes more emotionally complex than simple disgust or pity. Earlier societies were not waiting passively for modernity to rescue them. They adapted creatively within the constraints they possessed. Families organized washing days. Communities built bathhouses. Armies developed delousing systems. Sailors improvised maintenance rituals. Mothers taught children how to inspect seams and care for garments properly. Human beings repeatedly attempted to impose order on difficult environments, and often those environments pushed back. One revealing example comes from frontier settlements and pioneer communities. Popular imagination frequently portrays frontier life through ideas of freedom and rugged independence. Yet many settlers encountered intense physical hardship that made hygiene extraordinarily difficult. Cabins were cramped. Water access could be seasonal or distant. Winters were severe. Spare clothing remained limited. Laundry required enormous labor under already exhausting conditions. Under such circumstances, infestation was not unusual. Travel diaries from wagon trails and isolated settlements occasionally mention clothing becoming nearly impossible to keep fresh for long periods. Dust settled into fabric constantly. Rivers used for washing might freeze or flood unpredictably. Families traveling westward across North America, for instance, often lived in prolonged states of physical strain where clothing maintenance became secondary to survival itself. Again, this does not mean people abandoned hygiene standards entirely. Quite the opposite. Many settlers prized cleanliness intensely because it represented stability and self-respect amid uncertainty. But maintaining those standards required relentless effort. And effort had limits. A mother who spent the day hauling water, preparing food, tending fires, mending clothing, and caring for children might simply lack the remaining strength to boil garments thoroughly by nightfall. A traveler crossing difficult terrain might prioritize dry clothing over washed clothing. A laborer with one surviving winter coat could not risk damaging it through excessive cleaning. These compromises accumulated quietly across millions of lives. And compromises often became culturally normalized. Certain smells, textures, and irritations simply belonged to expected experience. Wool scratched, boots rubbed, linen stiffened, bedding carried traces of repeated use. Clothing rarely felt entirely neutral against the skin. This physical closeness to material reality shaped behavior subtly. People aired garments instinctively when weather allowed. They valued sunlight not only emotionally but practically. They noticed dampness immediately because dampness threatened comfort and health simultaneously. Storage mattered. Ventilation mattered. Fire mattered. Even architecture responded over time. Homes gradually evolved toward improved airflow, separate sleeping spaces, dedicated washing areas, and more controllable indoor climates. These developments were not driven solely by aesthetics. They reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about what made bodies more or less bearable to inhabit. The story of Lice, then, quietly intersects with the story of domestic evolution itself. Why did separate bedrooms become desirable? Why did laundering technologies matter so profoundly? Why did public sanitation projects receive political attention? Why did hot water systems transform urban life so dramatically? Part of the answer lies in the endless human desire to reduce friction between the body and the environment. And friction is precisely the right word. Imagine wearing the same rough wool garment repeatedly for days or weeks. Sweat dries into the fibers. Dust accumulates. Seams stiffen. Small insects move invisibly within folds. The fabric rubs the neck, underarms, waist, and wrists with continuous low-level irritation. Sleep offers only partial escape because the clothing remains nearby or partially worn. This was not a rare emergency. For many people, it was simply life. Yet historical narratives often omit these sensory realities because they seem too mundane beside politics or war. The result is a strangely sterilized version of the past in which people appear cleaner, more comfortable, and more physically detached from their environments than they truly were. The reality was more intimate. Bodies and surroundings constantly interacted. Smoke entered lungs and fabrics alike. Mud dried onto hems. Fleas traveled through bedding. Lice occupied seams. Water availability determined entire household rhythms. Comfort depended not on personal choice alone, but on systems of labor operating continuously in the background. This becomes particularly striking when examining the lives of women historically. Women often bore disproportionate responsibility for managing household hygiene despite possessing limited resources and little recognition for the labor involved. Laundry, mending, childcare, bedding maintenance, water hauling, and cleaning formed enormous portions of domestic work across centuries. And because these tasks repeated endlessly, they became socially invisible despite being absolutely essential. A household with cleaner clothing and reduced infestation usually reflected intense, ongoing labor somewhere behind the scenes. Someone boiled water. Someone scrubbed cloth. Someone repaired seams. Someone inspected bedding. Someone sacrificed hours maintaining conditions other family members depended upon. The history of lice, therefore, also becomes a history of hidden domestic labor. And hidden labor is often hardest to appreciate precisely because successful maintenance leaves few dramatic traces. If a laundress performed her work perfectly, the result appeared ordinary. Clean linen. The effort disappeared behind the outcome. But when systems failed, the consequences became immediately visible on the body. This imbalance shaped social judgment profoundly. Society often noticed infestation more quickly than it noticed the exhausting labor required to prevent infestation. And there was another uncomfortable reality as well. Not all fabrics behaved equally. Poorer people frequently wore rougher materials more difficult to wash comfortably or frequently. Wool retained warmth well but could become abrasive and harder to clean deeply. Linen, while easier to wash, remained more expensive in certain periods and regions. Cotton transformed clothing history partly because it combined relative affordability with greater washability and comfort. Textile history and hygiene history are deeply connected in ways many people never realize. The spread of affordable cotton garments during industrialization helped alter laundering patterns significantly. Lighter fabrics could be washed and dried more regularly than heavy woolens. Underclothing became more changeable. Hygiene expectations gradually shifted because material conditions shifted with them. Again, infrastructure and economics shaped bodily experience continuously. And even as improvements spread, older habits lingered surprisingly long. Many 20th century grandparents still remembered heating water manually for baths, wearing repaired garments repeatedly, or reserving best clothes for special occasions because laundering remained labor-intensive. The fully automated relationship modern societies have with clothing is astonishingly recent. In fact, some historians argue that modern people underestimate how revolutionary routine laundering actually was. Not dramatic invention, not political revolution, just the ordinary ability to wash clothing easily, regularly, and privately. Because once that became widespread, the emotional relationship between people and their own bodies began changing too. Freshness became expected rather than occasional. Clean bedding became ordinary rather than luxurious. Multiple clothing changes became routine. Physical discomfort narrowed from constant background condition into temporary exception. The psychological effect of this transformation is difficult to overstate. Earlier generations often developed remarkable tolerance for low-level discomfort because alternatives were limited. Modern populations, by contrast, increasingly organize daily life around minimizing bodily irritation wherever possible. Climate control, soft fabrics, instant hot water, detergents, private bathrooms, mattresses, deodorants, and abundant clothing all work together to create a historically unusual environment of sustained comfort. And because that comfort feels normal now, people sometimes forget how contingent it really is. During wars, blackouts, refugee crises, natural disasters, or homelessness, modern individuals can quickly rediscover how dependent comfort remains on functioning systems. Laundry piles accumulate rapidly without machines. Dampness spreads. Clothing becomes difficult to rotate. Sleep quality deteriorates. Small bodily irritations intensify surprisingly fast. The old world waits closer beneath the surface than many realize. This may be why historical accounts of infestation continue to feel oddly unsettling today. They force modern listeners to confront how vulnerable the human body still is beneath technological systems. Remove enough infrastructure, and ancient problems return with alarming speed. And throughout history, people understood this instinctively even without modern scientific language. That is why clean clothing carried symbolic power far beyond appearance alone. Fresh linen suggested order overcoming disorder. It suggested temporary victory over sweat, smell, exhaustion, and contamination. It reassured people that the body could still be managed despite difficult circumstances. One sees this clearly in religious and ceremonial traditions as well. Across many cultures, washing and clean garments became associated with purification, respectability, transition, and renewal. Part of this symbolism was spiritual, but part was undeniably physical too. Anyone living in historically difficult hygienic conditions understood emotionally what clean fabric felt like against tired skin. The sensation itself carried meaning. And perhaps nowhere was this more emotionally charged than during illness. A feverish patient placed into fresh bedding. A wounded soldier receiving clean bandages and linen. A child washed after days of sickness. These acts represented care at the most intimate level because they directly altered bodily experience. Medical reformers gradually recognized that cleanliness did not merely comfort patients psychologically. It materially affected survival. Reducing infestation and maintaining cleaner environments lowered infection risks, improved rest, and preserved strength. But achieving those conditions required labor on enormous scales. Hospitals built laundries. Armies organized sanitation corps. Cities invested in water systems. Schools instituted hygiene inspections. Entire bureaucracies emerged around maintaining bodily environments previously managed within households alone. This transfer of responsibility from family labor toward institutional infrastructure marked one of the great hidden transformations of modern history. And yet, despite all these changes, there remained one persistent challenge that no society ever solved completely. Human beings continue moving, gathering, migrating, fighting wars, fleeing disasters, and living unevenly, which means the old relationship between bodies, clothing, crowding, and parasites never disappeared entirely. It merely retreated into the margins, waiting wherever systems weakened enough for seams, blankets, and exhausted bodies to once again become shelter for something unwanted. And those margins reveal something uncomfortable about modern life itself. Many people in industrialized countries imagine hygiene as a personal achievement, a matter of discipline and routine. But history suggests something more fragile. The ability to remain consistently clean depends heavily on stable systems operating quietly in the background every day. Electricity, plumbing, affordable housing, laundry access, time outside survival labor, regular access to clean water, enough clothing to rotate garments between washings. Take away several of those elements at once, and older conditions begin reappearing with surprising speed. This became painfully visible during refugee crises throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In camps built rapidly for displaced populations, Aid workers often faced the same practical problems armies and reformers had encountered centuries earlier. Too many bodies in too little space, insufficient washing facilities, limited bedding, damp weather, exhaustion, scarcity of spare clothes. And again, the issue was never simply insects. Infestation became a sign that ordinary rhythms of human maintenance had broken down. People no longer controlled their sleeping arrangements, their clothing rotation, or their access to privacy and cleanliness. In such conditions, even small acts of bodily care became difficult. Yet people still tried. This persistence is one of the most striking continuities across the entire history. No matter how harsh conditions became, individuals usually attempted to preserve some form of personal order. A mother brushing out blankets, a prisoner washing socks secretly, a refugee airing garments on fencing wire beneath weak sunlight, a homeless man carefully folding the only clean shirt he owns. These acts are easy to overlook from the outside because they appear small. But psychologically, they matter enormously. They restore agency in situations where much else has become uncontrollable. And this perhaps explains why clean clothing carries such emotional weight in memory. When survivors of wars, migrations, prisons, or poverty speak about relief, they often mention bodily details rather than abstract political ideas. A hot bath, fresh sheets, dry socks, a clean collar, soap, warm water, the ability to sleep without scratching. Comfort returns first through the body. That truth has shaped humanitarian work more deeply than many people realize. Modern disaster relief increasingly recognizes that preserving dignity matters alongside preserving life. Clothing distribution, bathing facilities, menstrual hygiene supplies, laundry services, and private washing spaces are not luxuries added later. They are foundational to psychological recovery and disease prevention alike. History taught those lessons slowly, through centuries of repeated suffering. And in many ways, the modern disappearance of body lice from everyday awareness created a strange historical blindness. Once a problem fades from common experience, people begin assuming it belonged only to a primitive or uniquely miserable past. But the reality is more complicated. Even during the 20th century, outbreaks still occurred in surprising places. Homeless shelters, detention centers, areas affected by war or economic collapse, overcrowded institutions. Public health officials learned repeatedly that parasites thrive less because of ignorance than because of instability. The biology remained patient. A louse does not require civilization to collapse entirely. It merely requires enough interruption in ordinary washing and clothing systems, enough crowding, enough exhaustion, enough repeated use of the same garments. And the speed at which those conditions can emerge has often startled authorities. During wartime mobilizations, for example, enormous effort frequently went into preventive sanitation not because governments suddenly became compassionate, but because they feared how quickly deterioration could spread through crowded populations. Delousing stations, mobile showers, laundry facilities, disinfectants, and clothing inspections became integral parts of military logistics. What is fascinating is how modern these systems sometimes looked, and yet how ancient the underlying problem remained. A 20th century soldier standing in line for delousing treatment was participating in a struggle fundamentally recognizable to a Roman legionary inspecting tunics beside a fire centuries earlier. The technologies differed. The awareness of disease differed, but the bodily reality was remarkably continuous. And continuity is important here because it prevents the past from feeling alien. Modern people still inhabit vulnerable bodies. We still depend on sleep, warmth, dry clothing, and manageable environments. The difference is that many of the systems protecting those conditions now operate so invisibly that we barely notice them unless they fail. A washing machine breaks, and laundry suddenly becomes labor again. Hot water disappears, and bathing changes emotionally within hours. A power outage in winter quickly reveals how dependent indoor comfort truly is on infrastructure. Earlier generations lived closer to those dependencies constantly. This closeness shaped their sensory world in profound ways. Smell, for example, occupied a much larger role historically than modern people often appreciate. Clothing absorbed bodies and environments continuously. Smoke from fires settled into fabric. Sweat lingered, while held odors. Damp bedding developed its own smell. Crowded rooms carried the scent of many bodies sharing limited air. Against that background, the smell of fresh linen or soap became especially meaningful. One can almost imagine the emotional relief attached to laundry day in some households. Steam rising from boiled cloth, damp sheets hanging outdoors, the temporary freshness of fabric before it returned to ordinary use. These moments offered sensory reassurance that disorder could still be pushed back, however briefly. And briefly may be the key word. Earlier people often understood cleanliness as temporary from the beginning. Modern advertising sometimes presents hygiene as near-permanent if proper products are purchased. Historical experience taught something harsher and more realistic. The body constantly returns to maintenance. Skin produces oil. Clothes absorb sweat. Dust accumulates. Bedding traps moisture. Parasites exploit opportunity. Entropy never fully disappears. Perhaps this is why the history of lice ultimately becomes philosophical as much as practical. It reminds us that civilization is not a fixed achievement but an ongoing process of maintenance. Not grand monuments alone, but washing, heating, draining, cleaning, mending, repairing, airing, and caring for bodies repeatedly over time. Without maintenance, systems decay surprisingly quickly. This reality became obvious during outbreaks of epidemic disease throughout history. Public panic often focused first on visible signs of disorder: dirty bedding, infested clothing, overcrowded rooms. Sometimes those fears produced useful sanitation reforms. Other times they fueled prejudice and scapegoating. The line between public health concern and social fear was often dangerously thin. Immigrant communities, prisoners, the poor, and displaced populations were frequently described in language emphasizing contamination and infestation. Sometimes the descriptions reflected genuine harsh conditions. But the moral interpretation attached to those conditions could become deeply dehumanizing. This is one reason the history must be handled carefully. Discussions of hygiene have historically been used both to reduce suffering and to justify cruelty. Public bathhouses can be tools of dignity. Forced delousing can become instruments of humiliation. Laundry programs can preserve health. Hygiene inspections can shame vulnerable children. The same practical problem repeatedly intersects with questions of power, control, and human worth. And perhaps nowhere is that tension clearer than in institutional life. Prisons, barracks, orphanages, workhouses, and boarding schools all struggled historically with the challenge of managing large groups of bodies within limited resources. Officials feared infestation partly because it threatened order itself. Scratching, sleeplessness, illness, odor, and visible deterioration undermined discipline and morale. As a result, institutions often developed highly regulated routines around washing and clothing maintenance. Uniforms simplified laundering. Scheduled bathing standardized hygiene. Blanket inspections became common. Yet these systems could feel both protective and invasive simultaneously. A child subjected to public inspection might experience humiliation even if the stated purpose was disease prevention. A prisoner forced through delousing procedures could feel stripped not only physically but psychologically. Again, the body becomes political territory, and clothing sits directly at the center of that territory because it mediates between the self and the outside world. Clothing protects, conceals, identifies, and comforts. When it becomes infested, the invasion feels unusually intimate. This emotional intimacy helps explain why lice appear so often in memory despite seeming historically insignificant at first glance. People forget many ordinary details of life, but they remember what affected the body continuously. A former soldier may not recall every order he received, yet vividly remember the sensation of scratching beneath muddy wool. A refugee may forget dates and routes but remember desperately trying to keep children's clothing dry. A prisoner may remember the humiliation of surrendering infested garments more sharply than official procedures surrounding it. Memory often preserves physical feeling more faithfully than abstract chronology. Historians increasingly recognize this now. The study of sensory history attempts to reconstruct what earlier lives actually felt like rather than merely what happened politically. And once that approach is adopted, parasites stop seeming trivial, because they shape sensation constantly. The itch beneath a collar during church, the embarrassment of scratching in public, the roughness of overwashed wool, the relief of sun-warmed bedding, the smell of soap after weeks without it, the exhaustion of laundering by hand. These experiences formed part of the emotional architecture of everyday life, and they influenced behavior in subtle ways. People avoided sharing beds with certain strangers. Travelers carried anxieties about inns. Soldiers dreaded prolonged campaigns partly because they knew bodily deterioration awaited them. Families prized private sleeping space not merely for modesty but for comfort and health. Domestic competence became associated with maintaining order against constant physical encroachment. Even courtship and intimacy were affected. Modern romance often assumes relatively stable bodily cleanliness as background condition. Historically, maintaining presentable clothing and bodily freshness could require substantial effort. Special occasions often involved careful preparation precisely because everyday life was harsher physically. A clean shirt for church, fresh linen for a wedding, washed hair before visiting family. These rituals carried practical meaning beyond symbolism. And there is another irony hidden inside all this. For centuries, many societies associated visible elegance with refinement while remaining dependent on invisible labor, preventing bodily disorder behind the scenes. Grand houses required armies of servants partly because human beings generate constant maintenance needs. The larger the household, the greater the struggle against dust, dampness, odor, stains, insects, and wear. Luxury was never truly effortless. It was outsourced effort. This becomes especially striking in historical palaces and aristocratic residences. Visitors admired chandeliers, tapestries, polished floors, and fine clothing. But hidden beneath that elegance existed laundry rooms, servants' corridors, storage systems, drying areas, and endless cycles of cleaning and repair. Without continuous labor, even magnificent environments deteriorated quickly, and that truth scales upward to entire societies. Cities remain habitable only through relentless maintenance. Sewers cleared, water purified, bedding washed, waste removed, housing ventilated, clothing manufactured and cleaned continuously. The disappearance of lice from everyday middle-class awareness was not the triumph of one invention. It was the cumulative effect of thousands of interconnected systems operating reliably together, which makes the historical story strangely humbling. Because beneath modern assumptions about cleanliness and comfort lies a reality earlier generations understood instinctively. The line between order and bodily discomfort is thinner than it first appears. And whenever that line weakens, through war, poverty, disaster, displacement, or neglect, the oldest struggles hidden inside fabric seams have a way of returning quietly, almost as if they had never left at all. And whenever that line weakens, through war, poverty, disaster, displacement, or neglect, The oldest struggles hidden inside fabric seams have a way of returning quietly, almost as if they had never left at all. Across centuries, the history of lice is, in many ways, a history of the human body negotiating its environment. Bodies trapped in clothing, layered with labor and care, constrained by material limits, and continuously negotiating comfort and dignity. It is a story that threads together work, war, family, migration, poverty, and infrastructure into the intimate texture of daily life, revealing how survival often depended on managing the tiniest, most persistent threats. From medieval cottages to crowded trenches, from industrial cities to refugee camps, the presence of lice shaped experience, memory, and human behavior in ways both subtle and profound. The small, almost invisible organisms carried lessons about endurance, adaptation, and resilience. They illuminate the ways ordinary people managed complex systems of labor, hygiene, and care long before modern infrastructure made cleanliness almost effortless. They remind us that what seems mundane, like clean clothes or a warm bed, is historically contingent, and that comfort is never guaranteed without ongoing work, both visible and invisible. And yet, amidst the fatigue, the scratching, the careful folding and airing of garments, there emerges a quietly human story of individuals striving for dignity in difficult circumstances, of families preserving routine amid chaos, of communities improvising solutions when systems failed, and of entire societies gradually building infrastructure to protect bodies from the vulnerabilities that once shaped so much of daily life. Perhaps the most striking reflection is that these lessons remain relevant today. Modern societies may take clean clothing, heated water, and private sleeping space for granted, but anywhere those systems falter, the same ancient challenges reappear. And in that continuity lies a profound connection across time. The intimate, often invisible struggles of the past echo in the present, reminding us that history is not only what we construct in monuments or documents, but also what our bodies endure and manage every day. If this exploration of human endurance, hidden labor, and the quietly persistent presence of lice has captured your curiosity, consider subscribing to continue this calm, deep dive into the overlooked textures of history. And I'd love to hear from you. What detail from the everyday lives of people in the past surprised you most? Or which ordinary struggle would you like us to explore next? The story, as always, continues, thread by thread, seam by seam, through the intertwined histories of humanity and the small, persistent challenges that have shaped our world in ways we rarely see.